Welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're taking a close look at the world of Philippine defense and geopolitics.
A fascinating area for sure.
I think so too. I was looking through the stack of academic papers and articles you sent over, and it paints a pretty vivid picture of all the different forces at play, shaping the security landscape for the Philippines.
It really is a complex web, especially given the Philippines' unique geography. It's not just about military might.
Yeah, you're right. It's kind of like a puzzle, figuring out what the Philippines needs to navigate these, let's call them choppy waters.
A good analogy. I mean, you think about it, the Philippines is more than just a dot on the map, right? It's
Yeah.
actually more like a linchpin balancing economic currents, regional dynamics, and even those big global power plays.
Okay, so let's unpack this puzzle. And I guess we should start with the elephant in the room, or should I say the dragon in the sea. China's been making some pretty bold moves in the South China Sea, haven't they?
Absolutely. Their nine-dash-line claim, which basically covers almost the entire South China Sea, well, that sets the stage.
It's huge.
It is, and it overlaps with claims from several countries, including the Philippines, of course, and it's fueled a lot of tension.
And it's not just talk, right? They've been building artificial islands, even setting up military outposts on disputed reefs. What's the strategy there?
Well, it's about control, projecting power, and securing access to resources. Think of
Wow.
it this way. Those outposts give China a forward presence, right?
Yeah.
Which strengthens their claim to the area and all the resources there.
Speaking of claims, this brings us to the Philippines' response. And there's this term that keeps popping up. Minimum credible defense posture.
Right.
What does that actually mean in practice?
So think of it as a carefully calculated balancing act. The Philippines can't match China's military spending dollar for dollar, so they're focusing on making any kind of aggression too costly.
Oh, I see.
Investing in capabilities that make it really difficult for China to achieve a quick and decisive victory.
So instead of going toe-to-toe, they're making it more like stepping into a beehive.
Interesting analogy.
What are some examples of this strategy in action?
Well, they've acquired 2 reconditioned U.S. Coast Guard cutters, for example, to boost maritime security.
Okay.
Plus, there's the planned purchase of 12 F-A-50 fighter jets from South Korea.
So they're diversifying their suppliers too. Interesting.
It's a smart move. These acquisitions send a very clear message. The Philippines is serious about defending its interests.
It's like they're saying, we might be small, but we're not backing down.
Right.
But even with these moves, I mean, the Philippines still has a limited defense budget.
Of course.
So that's where their relationships with other countries come into play, right?
Exactly. You know, the U.S. pivot to the Asia-Pacific, increasing their military presence in the region, has been a major development.
Yeah.
And the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement between the U.S. and the Philippines, that's a key part of that. It allows for greater U.S. military access to Philippine bases.
So it's like the U.S. is that friend who always has your back, even if they sometimes overstay their welcome.
Haha, yeah, I guess you could say that. But it's not just the U.S. The Philippines is also strengthening ties with Japan and India, both of which are increasingly concerned about China's actions in the region.
It's like they're building their own posse to stand up to the bully. Tell me more about these new friends.
Well, Japan, for example, has really emerged as a significant security provider. They've agreed to transfer patrol boats to the Philippines, and they're increasing joint military exercises.
I see.
And India's Act East policy is leading to a growing military presence in Southeast Asia.
Interesting. It seems like the Philippines is playing a pretty delicate balancing act here, maintaining their traditional alliance with the U.S. while also forging these new partnerships.
They are. It's a tightrope walk, trying to deter China without provoking them, while also securing their own interests.
That's a tough position to be in.
It is a high-stakes game,
Yeah.
and they're playing it strategically.
Okay, so we've got China flexing its muscles, the Philippines beefing up its defenses, and the U.S. and other countries watching closely. Where does ASEAN fit into all of this?
ASEAN's a fascinating case. It's a regional grouping that includes most of the countries in Southeast Asia, including the Philippines, of course. They've been trying to play a mediating role in the South China Sea disputes, working towards a code of conduct.
Right.
But it's been a really slow and frustrating process.
Oh, I bet.
China's been dragging its feet, reluctant to agree to anything binding. And there are divisions within ASEAN itself. Some countries are more willing to appease China than others.
So ASEAN is like the well-meaning mediator who keeps getting ignored by the parties involved.
You could say that. And while they try to keep the peace, the Philippines has to deal with this pressure cooker of a situation. On top of all that, they have their own internal security issues to contend with.
Let's talk about those.
Well, one of the biggest is the ongoing conflict in Mindanao,
Mindanao,
the
right?
southernmost major island in the Philippines. This conflict has deep historical roots, stemming from grievances and a sense of marginalization among the Muslim population there.
It's been going on for decades, right? Has there been any progress towards peace?
There have been some steps forward. A peace agreement was reached with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, or MILF, the largest separatist group.
Okay.
But the situation is still fragile. There are other armed groups operating in the area, some even pledging allegiance to ISIS.
So it's like they're trying to put out one fire while another keeps flaring up?
Exactly. And this conflict has serious consequences. It diverts resources away from economic development and creates this instability that criminal groups and terrorists can exploit.
And speaking of criminal groups, the Philippines also has to deal with a growing transnational crime problem, right? Drug trafficking, human trafficking, arms smuggling.
Absolutely. The country's porous borders and, well, let's just say there are some weaknesses in law enforcement. This all makes it a pretty attractive target for these networks.
So it's like they're fighting a war on multiple fronts, both from within and outside their borders.
That's a good way to put it. And this all feeds into a larger conversation about how the Philippines can do it right when it comes to modernizing their armed forces. But maybe we should save that for after a short break.
Sounds good to me. We'll be right back.
Welcome back. Let's shift our focus now to a pivotal event. Something that really shook things up in the South China Sea, the Scarborough Shoal standoff back in 2012.
Yeah, this one felt like a David and Goliath story in the making. You've got a small nation like the Philippines facing off against, well, a giant like China. Set the scene for us. What exactly happened?
Okay, so picture this. Scarborough Shoal. It's this cluster of reefs and rocks just 120 nautical miles west of the Philippine island of Luzon. It's been a traditional fishing ground for Filipino fishermen for centuries.
Right.
But China claims it too.
So we've got a prime piece of real estate in a very contested neighborhood. What sparked the standoff?
Well, in April of 2012, Philippine authorities tried to arrest some Chinese fishermen who were allegedly fishing illegally in the area.
Okay.
China responded by sending a whole flotilla of surveillance vessels and fishing boats.
Wow, a flotilla. It sounds like a tense game of chicken played out on the high seas. What was the outcome?
It was a standoff for weeks. Neither side wanted to back down, and it really became a powder keg. Ultimately, the Philippines withdrew its vessels, but China, well, they remained and took control of the shoal.
That must have been a tough pill to swallow for the Philippines. What were the long-term repercussions of this standoff?
It was a watershed moment. I think that's the best way to describe it. It was a stark demonstration of China's resolve, their willingness to assert those claims, even if it meant using, force. For the Philippines, it was a wake-up call. It highlighted the limitations of their ability to defend their own waters.
Yeah, like getting your lunch money stolen and realizing you need to learn some self-defense.
Exactly. The standoff really had a profound impact on public opinion in the Philippines. Anti-China sentiment surged. There were calls for stronger defense capabilities.
So it was a wake-up call, forcing the Philippines to confront the reality of a more assertive China. How did they respond?
They knew they needed a new playbook, one that focused on deterring China, strengthening alliances, and finding more creative ways to protect their interests.
And that brings us back to that minimum credible defense posture we discussed earlier. It sounds like the Scarborough Shoal standoff was a catalyst for putting this strategy into action.
I think that's right. You could say it was the moment the Philippines decided to trade in their slingshot for something with a bit more firepower.
And a key part of that firepower comes from their long-standing alliance with the United States. Tell us more about that relationship and how it plays into the Philippines' defense strategy.
Well, the U.S.-Philippines alliance has deep roots, going all the way back to the Mutual Defense Treaty of 1951. The U.S. has been a major security partner, providing military assistance, intelligence sharing, and participating in joint training exercises.
So it's like a trusty old shield that the Philippines can rely on.
Yeah, in many ways, yes. But like any relationship, it's had its ups and downs.
Right. We talked earlier about President Duterte's pivot towards China. How did that affect the alliance?
Duterte really downplayed the importance of the U.S., even threatened to scrap the treaty altogether. He saw closer ties with China as a way to, secure economic benefits, reduce reliance on the U.S.
It sounds like he was playing a risky game trying to balance between these two giants.
It was definitely a gamble, and it definitely raised eyebrows in Washington. But since Duterte left office, there's been a course correction. The current administration has reaffirmed the value of the U.S. alliance and is working to deepen those defense ties.
So the pendulum is swinging back towards the U.S. What does that mean in practical terms?
Well, more joint military exercises, increased intelligence sharing, and potentially even greater U.S. military access to Philippine bases.
So the U.S. is back in the game, but the Philippines isn't putting all its eggs in one basket, right? They're also strengthening ties with other countries in the region.
That's right. Japan and Australia have emerged as key partners, sharing similar concerns about China's ambitions and a commitment to a rules-based order in the region.
It's like building a network of friends, each with their own strengths and connections.
And then, of course, there's ASEAN,
ASEAN, okay.
the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which the Philippines is very actively engaged with.
But we talked earlier about how ASEAN is struggling to find a unified voice on this South China Sea issue. How does that impact the Philippines' efforts?
It's definitely a frustration for the Philippines. They've been pushing for a stronger ASEAN response to China's assertiveness, but it's been a bit like herding cats.
Because some countries are more willing to accommodate China than others, right?
Yeah, that's a big part of it. Economic ties with China play a significant role, and some countries are just wary of provoking a giant.
So while ASEAN remains an important platform for dialogue, its effectiveness in actually dealing with these South China Sea disputes is limited. It's like having a family meeting where everyone agrees there's a problem, but no one wants to take responsibility for fixing it.
That's a perfect analogy. And the Philippines finds itself in this really tricky position. They need ASEAN to be strong and united, but they also have to look out for their own interests, even if it means going it alone sometimes.
So they're walking a tightrope, trying to balance their commitment to ASEAN with the urgent need to protect their own security.
It's a tough spot to be in, and all of this is happening against the backdrop of these significant internal security challenges, which we touched on earlier.
Right, the conflict in Mindanao is a constant drain on resources and a source of instability. Tell us more about the complexities of this conflict and the challenges it poses for the Philippines.
Well, it's a multifaceted conflict with deep historical roots, really intertwined with issues of identity, religion, and socioeconomic inequality. Various separatist groups have been fighting for autonomy or independence for decades.
And we've seen how external actors like ISIS have tried to exploit this situation for their own gain.
Exactly. The presence of ISIS-affiliated groups adds another layer of complexity and danger to an already volatile situation.
It's like trying to put out a fire while someone keeps throwing gasoline on it.
That's a chillingly accurate image. And this conflict has ripple effects that extend far beyond Mindanao. It diverts resources from development projects, undermines investor confidence, and just creates this climate of fear and uncertainty.
So it's not just a localized problem, it's a national security issue that impacts the entire Philippines.
Exactly. And finding a lasting solution will require a multi-pronged approach, addressing the root causes of the conflict, promoting economic development, strengthening institutions. It's a huge task.
It sounds like a monumental task, one that will require sustained effort and commitment from all sides.
And on top of all of that, the Philippines has to grapple with this growing threat of transnational crime, which we discussed earlier.
Right, this is another one of those hydra-headed monsters with tentacles reaching into various aspects of Philippine society. Drug trafficking, human trafficking, arms smuggling. It's a long list.
It really is. And it's fueled by this complex mix of factors: poverty, corruption, weak law enforcement, and porous borders.
It's like a virus that keeps mutating and finding new ways to infect the system.
And the effects are just devastating. It undermines the rule of law, fuels violence, and just erodes public trust in institutions.
So we've got all these internal security challenges layered on top of the external pressures from China, and then you add in the constant threat of natural disasters. It's a lot for any nation to handle, let alone one with limited resources like the Philippines.
It's true. It really is a testament to the resilience of the Filipino people that they've been able to navigate these treacherous waters for so long.
That resilience is really remarkable, but it's also a reminder of the high stakes involved. The decisions the Philippines makes in the coming years will determine whether they sink or swim in these, well, let's stick with the analogy, these choppy waters.
They will, and those decisions will be shaped not just by geopolitical calculations, but also by the human stories that are playing out on the ground. The stories of the fishermen whose livelihoods are threatened, the soldiers standing guard on those remote islands, the families rebuilding their lives after a typhoon.
Those stories are really the heart of this issue. They remind us why all of this matters.
And they should guide our understanding of what doing it right truly means for the Philippines. We need solutions that not only address the geopolitical challenges, but also prioritize the well-being and security of the Filipino people.
Solutions that empower them to build a more peaceful, prosperous, and resilient future. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, examining the forces shaping the Philippine security landscape and the choices they face.
We have. But as we move into our final segment, I think it's important to take a step back, consider a broader perspective, one that highlights how interconnected all of these issues are and the global implications of what's happening in the Philippines.
Okay, let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture then. We've been really focused on the Philippines, but this whole situation, it's much bigger than just one country, isn't it?
Absolutely. What's happening in the Philippines is really a microcosm of those larger geopolitical trends playing out all across the globe.
Yeah.
It's a stage where major powers, the U.S. and China, are vying for influence and control.
So the Philippines is caught right in the middle of this tug of war. How does their situation reflect these broader global dynamics?
Well, the South China Sea, with its vital shipping lanes and all those potential resources, it's become a flashpoint in this growing rivalry between the U.S. and China. The U.S., as that traditional guarantor of regional security, sees China's assertiveness as a threat to its interests and to the stability of the entire region.
Makes sense. And China, on the other hand, they probably see the U.S. presence in the region as meddling, an attempt to contain their rise.
Exactly. It's that classic security dilemma where actions taken by one side to enhance its security are perceived as threats by the other, leading to that spiral of escalation.
And escalation is never good.
Yeah.
So the Philippines is like a pawn in this high-stakes chess game, just trying to navigate the moves of these much larger players.
I see them more as a pawn with agency, actually.
Oh.
Yeah. They're not just passively accepting their fate, they're actively working to strengthen their own position, building partnerships, pursuing their own strategic goals.
That brings us to the concept of a multipolar world. It's been a hot topic lately. What does that mean, and how does the Philippines fit into it?
It's this idea that power is becoming more diffuse, with multiple centers of influence emerging, and that challenges the traditional dominance of the U.S.
Right.
Countries like China and India, and even those regional powers like the Philippines, are playing increasingly prominent roles.
So it's not just a bipolar world anymore, with the U.S. and the Soviet Union calling the shots. It's more like a multiplayer video game, with alliances shifting constantly, new players emerging.
Exactly. And in this more fluid and unpredictable environment, well, the Philippines has a real opportunity. They can leverage their strategic location, their growing economy, and their diplomatic skills to really chart their own course.
It's like being a small business in a rapidly changing market. You have to be nimble, adaptable, and strategic to survive and thrive.
Absolutely. The Philippines can't afford to be complacent. They need to be proactive, building relationships, diversifying their economic ties, and investing in their own security.
So it's not just about picking sides in a great power rivalry. It's about playing the game strategically, maximizing their own interests.
Exactly. And that requires a nuanced understanding of this complex interplay between domestic politics, regional dynamics, and global trends.
It's like a three-dimensional chess game, where each move has ripple effects across multiple boards.
A perfect analogy. The Philippines is proving to be a skilled player, making these calculated moves to advance their position in this complex game.
Okay, so we've explored the geopolitical chessboard and the Philippines' role in this evolving landscape. But as we wrap up our deep dive, I want to circle back to something we've talked about throughout our conversation, the human element.
It's crucial. Behind all the strategic maneuvering and policy debates, there are real people whose lives are directly impacted by these decisions.
We're talking about Filipino fishermen whose livelihoods are threatened by the South China Sea disputes, families displaced by conflict in Mindanao, communities struggling to rebuild after a typhoon. These are the faces we need to keep in mind.
They are. Their stories are a powerful reminder that security is not just about military hardware and strategic alliances. It's ultimately about human security. It's about creating the conditions where people can live in safety and dignity, and with the opportunity to build a better future.
And that brings us to a question that I've been thinking about throughout this deep dive. What does doing it right really mean for the Philippines?
It's a great question, and it's one that goes beyond simply acquiring weapons systems or forging alliances.
Right.
It's about making sure that security policies and strategies are aligned with the needs and aspirations of the Filipino people.
So it's not just about projecting power or deterring threats. It's about protecting people, empowering them to live secure and fulfilling lives.
Exactly. It's about building a future where Filipinos can fish in their traditional waters without fear, where communities in Mindanao can live in peace and prosperity, where families can rebuild their lives after a disaster without being plunged deeper into poverty.
It's about creating a Philippines that is not only secure from those external threats, but also resilient in the face of those internal challenges and those natural disasters.
A Philippines where human security isn't just a slogan, but a lived reality.
That's a powerful vision, and one that I hope the Philippines can achieve.
It won't be easy. There will be challenges, setbacks, and tough choices to be made.
Of course. But the Filipino people have shown time and again that they are resilient, resourceful, and determined to build a better future.
They have.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought. The Philippines is a nation at a crossroads, facing both profound challenges and extraordinary opportunities.
They are. The decisions they make in the coming years will shape not only their own destiny, but also the future of the region.
It's a story that deserves our attention, our understanding, and our support.
It does. And we hope this deep dive has equipped you, our listeners, with the knowledge and insights to engage with this story in a meaningful and informed way.
Thank you for joining us on this journey into the complex and fascinating world of Philippine defense and geopolitics.
We'll see you next time on the Deep Dive.